The morning mist clung to the Euphrates like the breath of sleeping gods, but beneath its shroud, death was already stirring. Prince Nebuchadnezzar II gazed across the river from his command tent, watching the crimson dawn paint the waters blood-red as if the very heavens knew what was to come. The year was 605 before the Common Era, and the fate of empires would be decided before the sun reached its zenith. "My lord," came the voice of General Nebuchadnezzar, his weathered face bearing the scars of countless battles. "The Egyptian forces have taken position at Kar. Pharaoh Necho II commands 40,000 men, seasoned warriors from the Nile Delta, and the last remnants of the Assyrian army." Nebuchadnezzar's jaw tightened. The Assyrians, once the terror of the ancient world, now reduced to begging for Egyptian protection. Their great capital of Nineveh had fallen to his father's armies 7 years prior, and their desperate flight to Haran had ended in defeat 3 years hence. Now they made their final stand alongside their former enemies, the Egyptians, in the shadow of Kakamisha's ancient walls. The prince turned from the river, his bronze armor catching the early light. At 25, he possessed the calculating mind of a strategist and the fierce heart of a lion. His army of 18,000 Babylonians represented the finest warriors. The land between the rivers could produce battle-hardened veterans who had carved out the new Babylonian empire from the ashes of Assyrian dominance. "What news from our scouts?" Nebuchadnezzar asked, studying the crude maps spread across his campaign table. "The Egyptians have fortified the crossing points, my lord. They control the high ground and have positioned their chariots to guard the flanks. Their infantry forms a shield wall 3 ranks deep, with archers behind." Nebuchadnezzar traced formations on the map with his finger. "They expect us to attempt a frontal assault across the river." Nebuchadnezzar smiled grimly. The World History Encyclopedia's documentation of ancient Mesopotamian warfare tactics would prove invaluable here, as it noted that traditional formations relied heavily on shield walls and missile troops. "Then we shall give them what they least expect." The sound of marching feet echoed across the camp as the Babylonian army prepared for battle. Spearmen checked their bronze-tipped weapons, archers strung their composite bows, and the elite guard donned their scale armor. The air thrummed with anticipation and the whispered prayers of men who might not see another sunset. As the sun climbed higher, Nebuchadnezzar assembled his war council. The fate of the Near East hung in the balance. Would Egypt extend its influence northward into Syria and maintain its alliance with the dying Assyrian remnant, or would Babylon claim dominance over the ancient crossroads of civilization? "Remember," the prince addressed his commanders, "today we fight not just for territory, but for the future of our people. The Egyptians believe their superior numbers and defensive position guarantee victory. They underestimate the fury of Babylon unleashed." The war horns began to sound across both camps, their deep notes carrying across the river like the voices of ancient demons. The Battle of Carchemish was about to begin, and the crimson dawn would soon give way to a day painted in the blood of heroes and the broken dreams of empires. The morning sun had burned away the mist, revealing the full scope of the Egyptian and Assyrian forces arrayed along the western bank of the Euphrates. Pharaoh Necho II sat astride his gilded chariot, his bronze armor gleaming like the scales of some primordial dragon. Beside him, the last Assyrian king, Ashurbanipal II, surveyed the battlefield with the desperate eyes of a man watching his dynasty's final hour. "The Babylonians mass for a river crossing," observed General Petabastus, Necho's chief military advisor. "Their formations appear standard infantry in the center, cavalry on the flanks." Prince Nebuchadnezzar shows his youth with such predictable tactics. Necho nodded, but something in the Babylonian prince's reputation troubled him. The son of Nabopolassar had never been defeated in battle, and his tactical innovations had shattered Assyrian resistance throughout the region. "Maintain our defensive posture," he commanded. "Let them break themselves against our shields." Across the river, Nebuchadnezzar was orchestrating an elaborate deception. While his main force made obvious preparations for a frontal assault, select units had been quietly moving upstream under cover of darkness. The prince's gambit relied on an ancient tactic, the feigned retreat combined with a devastating flanking maneuver. "Signal the advance," Nebuchadnezzar ordered. War drums thundered across the water as the first wave of Babylonian infantry entered the river, their shields locked and spears bristling like the quills of some massive beast. The crossing appeared chaotic, exactly as the prince intended. The Egyptians responded with a hail of arrows that darkened the sky. Bronze points found gaps in armor, and the Euphrates began to run red with blood. Men screamed and fell, their bodies carried downstream by the ancient current. But still the Babylonians pressed forward, their battle cries echoing off the walls of "They're brave. I'll grant them that," Necho muttered, watching the carnage unfold. "But bravery without wisdom leads only to glorious death." As the morning wore on, the Babylonian assault seemed to falter. Units began to waver and fall back, their formations breaking apart under the relentless Egyptian barrage. Necho allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The young prince had indeed proven himself too eager, too reckless. "Pursue them," the pharaoh commanded. "Drive them back to their desert holes." This was the moment Nebuchadnezzar had been waiting for. As the Egyptian and Assyrian forces abandoned their strong defensive positions to pursue the seemingly retreating Babylonians, the prince's hidden flanking force struck like a thunderbolt from the north. 2,000 elite warriors, led by the legendary commander Nebu, had crossed the river during the night and positioned themselves in the hills overlooking. The sound of war horns from an unexpected direction sent shockwaves through the allied ranks. Panic rippled through the pursuing forces as they realized they were caught between two Babylonian armies. The feigned retreat had become a deadly trap. "Form ranks," Necho shouted, his voice barely audible above the chaos. "Reform the line." But it was too late. The Babylonian pincers were closing, and the morning's careful formations had dissolved into confusion. Assyrian veterans, the last survivors of countless campaigns, found themselves fighting desperately alongside their former Egyptian enemies against a foe that had outmaneuvered them completely. As documented in ancient military chronicles, the Battle of Carchemish would prove to be one of the most decisive engagements in ancient warfare, marking the end of Egyptian aspirations in the Levant and the final collapse of Assyrian power. The Crimson Dawn had given way to a day of blood and bronze, and Prince Nebuchadnezzar's gamble was about to pay dividends that would echo through the ages. The battlefield had transformed into a cauldron of chaos, as steel met steel beneath the merciless sun. Prince Nebuchadnezzar's pincer movement had achieved its intended effect. The Egyptian and Assyrian forces, caught between two converging Babylonian armies, fought with the desperate fury of trapped beasts. Pharaoh Necho II, his royal composure shattered by the sudden reversal of fortune, rallied his guard around his golden chariot. "Stand firm," he bellowed, his voice carrying across the melee. "We are sons of the Nile. We do not yield to barbarians." The Egyptian center, despite being outflanked, held with remarkable tenacity. Veterans from campaigns in Nubia and the Levant formed tight formations, their bronze-tipped spears creating a deadly hedge against the Babylonian advance. The clash of metal on metal rang out like the hammering of the god's own forge. On the northern flank, these were the last survivors of Sargon's legions, men who had once terrorized the known world, now reduced to a desperate handful fighting for their very existence. Their purple banners, torn and bloodied, still flew defiantly even as their ranks thinned. "Fosh!" cried the last king of the Assyrians, Ashur-uballit II, as he drove his chariot into the Babylonian ranks. His bronze armor bore the scars of a dozen battles, and his eyes held the terrible knowledge that he was witnessing the death of his people's thousand-year dominion. The battle raged with unprecedented ferocity. According to military historians, the engagement at Carchemish represented a clash between the old world and the new, the fading powers of Egypt and Assyria against the rising might of Babylon. The very ground seemed to tremble under the weight of 40,000 men locked in mortal combat. Nebuchadnezzar, directing the battle from his command position, watched as his carefully laid plans unfolded with deadly precision. His father Nabopolassar had taught him that victory belonged not to the brave, but to the cunning. Today, that lesson would be written in blood upon the banks of the Euphrates. "Press the attack," the prince commanded, his voice carrying over the din of battle. "Give them no respite." The Babylonian infantry, their morale soaring from the success of their flanking maneuver, pressed forward with renewed vigor. Their formations, disciplined and well-drilled, began to compress the allied forces into an ever-tightening pocket. The Egyptian archers, their quivers emptying rapidly, found themselves engaged in desperate hand-to-hand combat as Babylonian spearmen reached their positions. In the center of the maelstrom, a single combat took place that would be remembered for generations. General Petabastus Necho's most trusted commander found himself face-to-face with Nebuzaradan, the Babylonian champion. The Egyptian, a veteran of countless campaigns, wielded his capiche with deadly skill, while the Babylonian swung his iron-edged sword with the precision of a master craftsman. Their duel, witnessed by hundreds of warriors from both sides, became a symbol of the greater struggle taking place. Bronze clashed against iron, tradition against innovation, the old world against the new. When Petabastus finally fell, his lifeblood seeping into the thirsty earth, a great cry went up from the Egyptian ranks, not of despair, but of recognition that their age of dominance was ending. The sun reached its zenith as the battle entered its most critical phase. The allied forces, compressed into an ever smaller area, fought with the courage of the doomed. But courage alone could not overcome the tactical brilliance of Nebuchadnezzar's strategy. As the shadows began to lengthen, the outcome of the Battle of Carchemish hung in the balance, though the scales were tipping inexorably toward Babylon. The Crimson Dawn had given way to a day of unprecedented carnage, and the ancient world would never be the same. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly upon the killing field. As the Battle of Carchemish reached its crescendo, blood had turned the earth into a crimson mud that sucked at the feet of warriors and horses alike. The air itself seemed to shimmer with the heat of battle and the cries of the dying. Pharaoh Necho II, his golden armor now dented and bloodstained, made a desperate decision. The Egyptian reserves, held back since dawn, would launch one final assault to break the Babylonian. These were the elite Magi warriors from Nubia, whose bronze spears had never known defeat, and the cracker regiments from Memphis whose shields bore the cartouches of pharaohs stretching back to the pyramid builders. "If we die today," Necho declared to his commanders, "we die as pharaohs die, with our faces to the enemy and our swords in our hands." The Egyptian counterattack struck the Babylonian left flank with the force of a flooding river. For a moment it seemed as though the tide might turn. The Meji warriors, their war paint streaming with sweat and blood, carved deep into the Babylonian ranks with their curved swords. Their battle cries, in the ancient tongue of Cush, sent shivers through veteran soldiers. But Nebuchadnezzar had anticipated this final gambit. As the Egyptian reserves committed themselves to the attack, the Babylonian prince unleashed his own force of Median cavalry that had been concealed in the hills since before dawn. These horsemen, allied to Babylon through marriage and treaty, swept down upon the Egyptian flank like a whirlwind of bronze and leather. The impact was devastating. The Egyptian reserves, caught between the anvil of Babylonian infantry and the hammer of Median cavalry, began to crumble. The proud warriors of the Nile, who had conquered Nubia and held the Levant for a generation, found themselves overwhelmed by the tactical genius of their young adversary. Ashur-bulit II, the last king of Assyria, saw his moment of final glory approaching. With his royal guard reduced to a handful of scarred veterans, he drove his chariot directly at Nebuchadnezzar's command position. The bronze wheels of his war machine carved through the mud as arrows whistled past his head. "For the glory of he screamed, his voice carrying the rage of a civilization dying, "for the honor of Sargon and Tik." The charge was magnificent in its futility. The last Assyrian king, surrounded by the remnants of an empire that had once ruled from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, made his final stand with the courage of a lion. His spear found its mark in a Babylonian officer's chest, and his sword opened the throat of another. But there were too many enemies and too few friends. When the bronze tip of a Babylonian lance pierced his heart, Ashur-bulit II fell from his chariot with a smile on his lips. The Assyrian Empire, which had dominated the ancient world for over 3 centuries, died with him in the mud of Kak. Necho, seeing the collapse of his Assyrian allies and the failure of his final gambit, made the hardest decision of his reign. The battle was lost, but Egypt itself could still be saved. Signaling to his remaining commanders, he ordered a fighting retreat toward the river crossing at Carchemish. The withdrawal was a masterpiece of military discipline. The Egyptian infantry, their shields locked and their spears bristling, backed slowly toward the ancient city while their archers provided covering fire. The Babylonians, exhausted from hours of combat, could not prevent the escape, though they exacted a terrible price for every yard of ground. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, the Battle of Carchemish entered its final phase. The field belonged to Babylon, but the war was far from over. The remnants of the Egyptian army, bloodied but not broken, would live to fight another day. According to ancient chronicles and modern archaeological evidence, the Battle of Carchemish marked the definitive end of the Assyrian Empire and the beginning of Egypt's withdrawal from the Levant, a turning point that would reshape the balance of power in the ancient Near East. The Crimson Dawn had given way to a day of unprecedented slaughter, and Prince Nebuchadnezzar stood on the threshold of greatness. The sun hung low in the western sky, painting the battlefield in shades of gold and crimson as the Battle of Carchemish drew to its bloody conclusion. The ancient city's walls, witnesses to countless conflicts over the millennia, now looked down upon a scene of unprecedented carnage. The Euphrates itself seemed to flow red with the blood of fallen warriors. Prince Nebuchadnezzar stood atop a small hill overlooking the field, his bronze armor bearing the dents and scratches of close combat. Around him, the victorious Babylonian army began the grim task of counting their dead and tending to their wounded. The price of victory had been high. Nearly 4,000 of his finest soldiers would never see their homes again. "The field is ours," my lord, reported General Nebuchadnezzar, his weathered face grim with exhaustion. "The Egyptian forces have retreated across the river. Pharaoh Necho II escaped, though his army is broken. Of the Assyrians, the general paused, his voice heavy with the weight of history. "There are no Assyrians left to speak of." The prince nodded solemnly. The last remnant of the empire that had once terrorized the known world lay scattered across the battlefield like broken pottery. Ashur-bulit II's body had been found beside his overturned chariot, his royal seal still clutched in his lifeless hand. With his death, a chapter of history 3 centuries in the making had finally closed. "What of our losses?" Nebuchadnezzar asked, though he dreaded the answer. "Heavy, my lord. The Egyptians fought like lions, and their Nubian allies showed no mercy. Nebuzaradan's flank attack cost us dearly. He fell leading the charge against the Egyptian center. A hero's death, but a grievous loss." The prince felt a pang of sorrow for his fallen commander. Nebuzaradan had been like an uncle to him, a mentor who had taught him the arts of war and state. His tactical brilliance had made the victory possible, but the cost had been his own life. As the Babylonian soldiers moved among the fallen, they began to understand the true magnitude of their victory. The combined Egyptian and Assyrian forces had numbered over 40,000 men. Now, scattered across the field of Carchemish lay the corpses of nearly half that number. The survivors, streaming southward toward Egypt, would carry with them the news of a defeat that would echo through the ages. "Send word to my father," Nebuchadnezzar commanded. "Tell King Nabopolassar that the last of the Assyrians has fallen, and that the road to Syria lies open. The empire he began building 20 years ago now stretches from the Persian Gulf to the borders of Egypt." The immediate aftermath of the battle revealed the strategic implications of the Babylonian victory. As noted in historical records, the defeat at Carchemish marked the end of Egyptian influence in the Levant and established Babylon as the dominant power in the ancient Near East. The political vacuum left by the collapse of Assyria would be filled by the rising Babylonian Empire. But victory carried its own burdens. As Nebuchadnezzar surveyed the field of his triumph, he understood that ruling an empire would prove far more difficult than conquering one. The diverse peoples of Syria, Palestine, and Phoenicia had submitted to Egyptian rule out of fear of Assyrian resurgence. Now they would need to be convinced that Babylonian dominion offered them a better future. The prince's thoughts were interrupted by a commotion near the river. A group of Babylonian soldiers had captured a wounded Egyptian officer, his fine armor marking him as a man of high rank. As they brought him forward, Nebuchadnezzar recognized him as one of Necho's chief lieutenants. "You have won a great victory, young prince," the Egyptian said, his voice steady despite his wounds. "But victory in battle is not the same as victory in war. Egypt has wealth and allies you cannot imagine. This defeat will not go unavenged." Nebuchadnezzar studied the wounded officer with respect. Even in defeat, the man showed courage and dignity. "Egypt is welcome to try," he replied. "But the age of Egyptian dominance in the north is over. The future belongs to Babylon." As darkness fell over the battlefield, the prince ordered his army to make camp among the ruins of Carchemish. Tomorrow they would begin the long march home, carrying with them the spoils of victory and the knowledge that they had participated in one of history's most decisive battles. The crimson dawn had given way to a day of blood and glory, and Prince Nebuchadnezzar had proven himself worthy of the crown that awaited him in distant Babylon. The morning after the battle of Carchemish broke gray and solemn over the field of the dead. Mist rose from the Euphrates like the souls of the fallen, and the ancient city's walls stood sentinel over a transformed world. Prince Nebuchadnezzar walked among the burial mounds where his soldiers lay at rest, their bronze armor gleaming dully in the pale light. The victory at Carchemish had cost both sides dearly. The Egyptian and Assyrian dead numbered in the tens of thousands, their bodies hastily buried in mass graves as was the custom after great battles. The Babylonian losses, though fewer, included many of the prince's most trusted commanders. The price of empire, he reflected, was always paid in the blood of the faithful. Milo called out a breathless messenger, his horse foam-flecked from hard riding. "Word from Babylon, King Nabopolassar has fallen ill. The physicians fear for his life. You are summoned home immediately." Nebuchadnezzar felt the weight of destiny settling upon his shoulders like a royal mantle. His father's illness meant that the crown of Babylon would soon be his, along with all the responsibilities of ruling an empire that now stretched from the Persian Gulf to the borders of Egypt. The young prince who had crossed the Euphrates seeking glory would return as a king. The march home took 15 days, during which reports reached the army of the political upheaval caused by their victory. The Phoenician cities of Tyre and Sidon had declared their allegiance to Babylon, seeking protection from potential Egyptian retaliation. The kingdoms of Syria and Palestine, seeing the writing on the wall, sent ambassadors bearing tribute and offers of submission, but not all the news was welcome. Egyptian gold had already begun flowing to potential allies, and there were rumors of a great coalition forming against Babylon. The pharaoh Necho II, though defeated, had not abandoned his ambitions in the Levant. The Battle of Carchemish had been decisive, but the war for regional dominance was far from over. As the Babylonian army approached the gates of their capital, crowds lined the processional way to cheer their returning heroes. The victory at Carchemish had electrified the empire, proving that the new Babylon could match the military prowess of the old Assyria. Young men pressed forward, eager to enlist in the victorious army. While merchants calculated the profits to be made from expanded trade routes, King Nabopolassar, propped up in his bed by silk cushions, received his son with tears of pride in his eyes. "My boy," he whispered, his voice barely audible, "you have given me the greatest gift a father could ask for, the knowledge that my life's work will continue in worthy hands." The old king's condition deteriorated rapidly over the following days. As he lay dying, he summoned his son for one final conversation. "Remember," he said, his grip on Nebuchadnezzar's hand surprisingly strong, "empires are not built on victory alone. They endure only when they offer their subjects something better than what came before. Rule with wisdom, my son, and the gods will smile upon your reign." Nabopolassar died 3 days later, and Nebuchadnezzar II was crowned king of Babylon in a ceremony that rivaled anything the ancient world had ever seen. The great ziggurats of the city were draped in royal purple, and representatives from dozens of subject nations brought tribute to their new lord. As documented in Babylonian chronicles, the new king's first act was to establish a new code of laws that would govern his expanded empire. Drawing upon the wisdom of Hammurabi and the practical experience gained from governing diverse peoples, these laws would become the foundation of Babylonian administration for generations to come. The Battle of Carchemish had been more than a military victory. It had been the birth of a new age. The old order, dominated by the decaying Assyrian Empire and sustained by Egyptian gold, had given way to a world where Babylon stood supreme. The young prince who had gambled everything on a single battle had become the architect of a new imperial order. Standing on the highest tower of his palace, looking out over the city that was now truly his, Nebuchadnezzar remembered the crimson dawn that had begun it all. The mist on the Euphrates, the clash of bronze on bronze, the cries of dying warriors, all had led to this moment. The Battle of Carchemish had not merely changed the political map of the ancient world, it had forged the destiny of empires. In the years that followed, King Nebuchadnezzar II would become one of history's most famous rulers, building the Hanging Gardens of Babylon and conquering Jerusalem. But none of his future triumphs would match the significance of that single day when steel met steel on the banks of the Euphrates, and the fate of the ancient world hung in the balance. The Crimson Dawn had given way to the Golden Age of Babylon, and the echo of that battle would resonate through the corridors of history for millennia to come.